Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be talking to you guys through what green stuff actually is. So, once you get your green stuff, it should look something like this, although I imagine yours will look a lot cleaner than mine. And it'll come in these two ribbons of blue and yellow stuff, I guess you could say. So when you mix them together, obviously you get green stuff. Very, very clever naming system. And the first thing I would suggest is when you're cutting off of these ribbons, make sure that you leave a tiny little bit right where the two pieces, or two parts rather, actually meet, because sometimes it can actually be a little bit set right there. So you kind of want to have a tiny little sliver that you don't actually cut, so that you only get the green stuff, or the two parts of the green stuff that haven't actually touched each other. So after that, you're going to want to mix these two things together and make sure that they are evenly mixed so that you have one solid color of green and you don't get any streaks throughout it. And while you're working with this and mixing them together, you're going to start to notice the first thing that makes green stuff a little bit different to work with than a lot of other sculpting supplies, and that's that green stuff is very, very sticky. You can see it kind of sticking to my thumb here. And there's a really easy way to kind of circumvent this, and honestly, you just have to cover your tools and your fingers in water. And here you can kind of see it's a lot easier to actually work with now that I've wet my hands. Speaking of tools, something that you're really going to want is these rubber-tipped sculpting tools. They're really instrumental, and I use them in every single sculpt that I do. Really, really important. And the tools that I find myself using the most of all of these is the round-tipped one and the flat-tipped kind of wedge-looking one. And these tools almost always have these metal tools on the other end of them, and I always find myself using this oval-shaped one primarily. All of these tools you can actually often get in these sets of 5, and so that really shouldn't be too important, but if you can only get individual ones for whatever reason, those are the tools that I would pick. And now I want to get a little bit into how green stuff actually feels to work with. Green stuff isn't quite like a clay that a lot of people might have used when they were in middle school art class or whatever. When you add water on top of green stuff, it doesn't flake at all. It stays together almost like you're working with a gum or something like that. It is, and I think that's also part of the reason that it's so sticky, because it just kind of stays together as one solid chunk and doesn't flake off or change texture as you add more water to it. I find this can be really helpful when you're working on small details, to not have to worry about certain parts of your sculpt being softer or harder. They're all going to be the same consistency the entire time that you're working with it. Or I should say that the green stuff that you mix will stay consistent within however long you've been working with it. Because as you work with it, you have about a 2-hour period where it's going to be really easy to work with, and then it'll slowly kind of harden and set, because it doesn't actually dry, which is an interesting point, because it doesn't matter how big or small the amount of green stuff you have, it will dry at an even rate because it's not actually drying, it's setting. It's got some chemical process going on between the two parts. And that's why I tell a lot of people that you can't actually just use air dry clay, because you'll get a tiny little piece that's protruding off of your miniature that's going to be dry, while the rest of your miniature is still wet, and so it's just really, really difficult to work with. And so that's why you need to use a 2-part epoxy. For those of you who are a lot more comfortable with using air dry clay and the sort, you can get other products, kind of like Milliput, that work really well as that same 2-part epoxy that feels like an air dry clay or something along those lines. And you can get Milliput because it's a slightly cheaper option and can even mix with your green stuff if you just want to make your green stuff go a little bit farther. And then it kind of feels like a weird halfway point between green stuff and Milliput, but this video is still technically about green stuff, so I'll get back on track. The other thing I wanted to mention was, if you're, let's say, making a miniature that has a bow staff or something like this, like I'm making this miniature have, it's really important that you always have a wire going through any long protrusions or something like that when you're sculpting. Here you can see I also filed down the wire so that the green stuff can stick to it better, but technically you could probably just have your wire filed beforehand with some sandpaper, but I always forget to do it, so I just do it with a hand file. And actually what I'm going to be doing here is you can see that I'm adding obviously a layer of green stuff around the wire that we just filed, but I wanted to also show you kind of why it's really important to have a wire going through it. Because if you don't, the plastic isn't hard enough to hold shape very well. It'll kind of just be flimsy and will break off really, really easily. So having a wire going through it just makes the miniature a lot more durable, and so durable that honestly, I don't actually worry about any of my miniatures breaking or falling apart because all of the pieces have a wire going through them, and they're actually really, really hardy once this green stuff sets. And here you can see what I mean. The side of the green stuff that I added over the wire is really strong and sturdy, whereas the stuff that doesn't have a wire in it is just kind of flimsy and I could easily just break it off. So that's why always having an armature going through whatever you're sculpting is really, really important.
So I hope you guys found this video helpful as just kind of like an introduction to what green stuff is. I tend to get this question a lot in the comments, so I felt like it was a good idea to just kind of run through some of the basics of how to use it as a material. Since I've kind of mentioned some of this stuff in other videos about sculpting, I don't know, I thought it would be cool to just have a video that was dedicated to the question of what is green stuff. If you enjoyed that video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, hit the bell to get notified when I release other videos, because that stuff is just super, super helpful for a small growing channel. But nonetheless, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.